The U.S. House gaveling in for legislative work, taking up a bill that would remove the gray wolf from the list of endangered species.
Recognition.
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 1142 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 191, House Resolution 1142. Resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill H.R. 6784 to provide for removal of the gray wolf in the contiguous 48 states from the list of endangered and threatened wildlife published under the Endangered Species Act of 1973. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources, and 2, 1 motion to recommit. Section 2, on any legislative day during the period from November 19, 2018 through November 26, 2018, A, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and B, the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time within the limits of Clause 4, Section 5, Article 1 of the Constitution to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 3, the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2 of this resolution as though under Clause 8A of Rule 1. Section 4, the provisions of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution 50 U.S.C. 1546 shall not apply to House Concurrent Resolution 138.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 hour.
Mr. Speaker, during consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, House Resolution 1142, providing for further consideration of H.R. 6784, the Manage Our Wolves Act. The rule provides for consideration of the legislation under a closed rule. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to have co-introduced the underlying legislation considered in this rule today, H.R. 6784, the Manage Our Wolves Act, to return management of the gray wolves species to the states. The states are best equipped to provide more effective and accountable management that responds to the needs of the ecosystem, other species, as well as local communities. On June 13, 2013, under the Obama administration, the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published in the Federal Register a proposed rule that would have removed the gray wolf from the list of endangered and threatened wildlife. This determination was made after Fish and Wildlife evaluated the classification status of gray wolves currently listed in the contiguous United States under the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and found, and I quote, "The best available scientific and commercial information indicates that the currently listed entity is not a valid species under the Act," end quote. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to recover species to the point where they are no longer considered endangered or threatened. The gray wolf is currently found in nearly 50 countries around the world and has been placed in the classification of least concern for risk of extinction by the Species Survival Commission of the International Union for Conservation Nature. Some of my colleagues have asked, well, if Fish and Wildlife have proposed to delist the species, why haven't they done so? That is a completely fair and reasonable question. Unfortunately, it is due to the fringe environmentalist efforts that any action from moving forward under the law has been stalled. So long as the courts are abused to prevent the proper adjudication of the law, we will not see progress made. And it is because of this exploitation of the law that communities like those in central Washington suffer the consequences. Mr. Speaker, in my home state, the great state of Washington, the gray wolf is not listed in just the eastern third of the state, forcing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to rely on an arbitrary political boundary when delineating and managing a species. I'm sorry to share with you, Mr. Speaker, that as it turns out, surprisingly, wolves don't know boundaries or borders. The arbitrary nature of this current status of the law is broken, and it is impairing the ability of fish and wildlife managers on the ground to properly manage the species as well as its ecosystem, including the harm it poses on other indigenous species. Mr. Speaker, this is why Congress, as a co-equal branch, must act. This legislation directs the U.S. Department of the Interior to follow through with the proposed rule and delist the gray wolf from the list of endangered species. We have a responsibility to protect the incredibly diverse species, both in Washington state and across this country. These efforts to protect our wildlife species must be based on sound science and an open, transparent process. Unfortunately, to the process dictating endangered species policies, particularly in this case of the gray wolf. For years now, Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife has asked the federal government to delist the gray wolf and provide relief from the burdensome, broken process dictating species management. I have received letters from the director of the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, one in 2015 and one earlier this year, and would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, for them to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
In them, the letters read, and I quote, "Dear Congressman Newhouse, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife appreciates your continued assistance to encourage the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to complete the delisting of the gray wolf and remove it from federal protection under the endangered species list." It continues, in 2008, the first wolf pack was documented in Washington state. Today, we have 22 known packs. During this time, the state's wolf population has increased by an average of more than 30% per year. As demonstrated with the current rate of recovery, the department is well suited to facilitate the recovery and management of wolves across the state. Under the current federal designation and management, we cannot fully implement our plan in the western two-thirds of the state. To ensure ongoing success in wolf recovery, the federal listing needs to keep pace with the on-the-ground recovery status and allow the state to fully implement its management plan. Therefore, I support your efforts to advance the delisting of wolves and return management to the state, end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, to close, I would just like to say that as a farmer and a lifelong resident of central Washington state, I consider myself a conservationist and a steward of our rich natural heritage, and that includes our incredible wildlife. State governments are fully qualified to responsibly manage gray wolf populations and are better able to meet the needs of local communities, of ranchers, of livestock, wildlife populations, and ecosystems. I encourage my colleagues to support the rule and the underlying legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, for the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we are here today considering our first rule following a long district work period. During that time, we had a big national debate about the direction of our country. According to exit polling, the top issue for voters was health care, and in particular, protecting coverage for pre-existing conditions. But that's not what the bill before us addresses. Nor does it involve immigration, another top issue for voters, or strengthening the economy, or combating gun violence, All of these are what our constituents just said was important to them. But instead of doing anything on any of that, we're here today considering a bill to undermine endangered species protections. Are you kidding me? Also, and get this, also last night in the Rules Committee, the majority placed a provision in the rule that would remove the privileged status of Representative Khanna's War Powers Resolution, H-Con Res 138. This resolution states that Congress never authorized the United States support of Saudi-led forces in Yemen and would direct the President of the United States to end his support. This measure is a privileged resolution under the terms of the War Powers Resolution, which provides that resolutions concerning the involvement of U.S. military in armed conflict have a direct path to the floor to be debated and to be voted on. The rules provided this privileged status because such questions are among the most important that the People's House can debate. Such privileged resolutions, or a negotiated substitute, have come before the House under Republican and Democratic majorities. Yet, with this rule before us today, Republicans have taken the unprecedented step of striking this privilege, preventing us from doing our constitutional duty, and foreclosing the only available mechanism to compel an up or down vote in Congress regarding our military involvement in the Yemen war. As of this morning, this bill, introduced by Congressman Khanna, has over 80 bipartisan co-sponsors, including Democratic Whip Hoyer and Ranking Members Smith, Lowy, Engel, and myself. The U.S.-Saudi military campaign in Yemen has triggered the world's worst humanitarian crisis, prompting the late Saudi dissident Jamal Khashoggi to call for an end to the war. Published just weeks before his murder, Khashoggi's Washington Post column was headlined, and I quote, "Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince must restore dignity to his country by ending Yemen's cruel war," end quote. It is unconscionable for Republican leadership to take this unprecedented action to strip members of their right to bring such measures to the floor for debate. Mr. Speaker, what is the majority afraid of? We should be debating this. Instead, the Republican majority continues to turn a deaf ear to this and many other issues. You know, we're 11 days away from our government running out of funding. 5 appropriations bills have been signed into law so far. They have funded 75% of the government, but there is more work that we need to do. We should be continuing that momentum and getting the job done, keeping the lights on, not wasting time considering a bill to attack an endangered species. Or how about reauthorizing the National Flood Insurance Program? That expires at the end of this month. Or putting a comprehensive reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act on the House floor. That is set to expire December 7th. Not to mention the need to reauthorize the Farm Bill. That expired back on October 1st. Our country's farmers are depending upon this Congress to put into place a new bill that provides them with certainty, especially in light of the trade war that President Trump has started. Yet the majority has instead prioritized a bill that completely ignores all the important issues that we face in this country. The American people have clearly had enough. They demanded a new direction and a new Congress that actually addresses what they care most about, and they demanded an end to this closed process. This rule marks the 102nd closed rule of this Congress. Now let me repeat that. The 102nd closed rule. Mr. Speaker, that is a staggering number. Now, I'm not suggesting that every rule needs to be an open one or that there is never a time for a closed rule, but there is never a time for more than 100 closed rules. There is no justification for that at all. Since the election, I heard my friends on the other side of the aisle express a hope that the next Congress is a more accommodating one. That's ironic since the Republicans have voted in lockstep for one closed rule after another, after another, after another. But to them I ask, why wait? A Democratic majority will certainly be better than the current one, but Republicans don't have to wait until January. They could demand a more open process here today by voting against this closed rule. So this is your chance to prove that your newfound calls for openness are about more than politics. Vote against this record-breaking closed rule. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just a couple of points in response to my good friend from the state of Massachusetts. You know, certainly there are a lot of important issues in front of us and things that we should and will be addressing. But I gotta say, as a representative of Central Washington and represent communities that deal with wolf populations on a daily basis, I don't think it's fair or proper even for my good friend to minimize or diminish the importance of the issue that we have in front of us today. And so with all due respect, the importance of managing wolves in our country deserves just as much attention as many of the other issues that my good friend from Massachusetts referenced. And also, as relates to the CANA resolution, you know, just as you said, just a few short weeks, your party will assume the majority. They will have the opportunity. You will have the opportunity to hold the hearings, the markups, to take the votes, the all-important regular order that you continually talk about. So I'm looking forward to that. But forcing this type of vote on members in the remainder of this Congress, in my view, is just unnecessary at this time. And Mr. Speaker, at this juncture, I'd like to recognize or give some time to my good friend from the state of Oregon, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Greg Walden.
How much time?
4 minutes, sir.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, to my colleague from Washington State, thank you for bringing this rule to the floor. Thank you for addressing this issue. It's literally one of great importance in my district and in the West. And I rise in strong support of the underlying bill, the Manage Our Wolves Act, because we need to clarify the management of wolves in Oregon and put us on a path to follow the locally state-written Oregon Wolf Plan. You know, for years, Mr. Speaker, ranchers across my district have watched as wolf packs have grown. They harass cattle herds and they kill livestock, and they are brutal. When you lose a heifer, you don't just lose one cow. You lost 10 years' worth of calves that will never be born and they'll never be able to be sold. Those that aren't killed are harassed, often losing weight and value. They're chased all over by the wolf packs. The cattle and sheep these ranchers raise are their livelihoods. Every day, sun, rain, snow, they raise and care for these animals. And when a first-time mom is struggling to feed a new calf, the rancher nurtures them, sometimes even literally bringing them into their own home next to the wood stove to warm them up and keep the calf alive in the winter. That care makes it all the harder to come upon a calf that has been torn apart by wolves. And if you're of young age or whatever, I would just give you a fair warning. This is a graphic picture of what happens when a wolf gets a hold of a calf. A rancher wrote me earlier this year that 3 of her calves were attacked, and she described the attackers, described them as, quote unquote, wild-eyed with terror after being mutilated by wolves. Just like this one you see here from a calf that was killed by wolves in Wallowa County, ripped apart. This rancher went on to write, "The rush of emotions one feels when you see an animal you have nurtured that's crying for help, panic in their eyes, searching for escape." She said no one wants to see that and described it as watching your worst horror movie in slow motion. Now, the ranchers have done a lot in this effort. They've watched as attacks continue, though, despite their efforts to implement largely ineffective, non-lethal control techniques they were asked to do. Meanwhile, the issue at the heart of this matter is there are arbitrary lines on a map that were created a jurisdictional mess in my state of Oregon, where wolves in eastern Oregon are managed by the state, and right across this highway, they're managed by the federal government. Today's legislation that we'll consider fixes that by ensuring that all wolves in Oregon are removed from the federal endangered species list. This would then return the management to the state and allow wolves, like other wildlife, to be managed under collaboratively developed Oregon law. There are still challenges with state management. There's no doubt about that. And we've seen times when the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Service has been slow to take action and implement the hard-fought agreements in the wolf plan to help prevent predation and to control the wolf packs. State needs to step up and uphold these agreements, but those are issues we can work out as Oregonians. The last thing we need, however, is the federal government trying to micromanage wolves from thousands of miles away. This legislation that hopefully we are able to bring up because of this rule will get the federal government out of the way. It will simplify the jurisdiction and will place all wolves in Oregon under the state management plan. So I strongly urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the rule and the underlying legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman from Washington State, my good friend, Mr. Newhouse, seemed to imply that it would be an inconvenience for us to have the House consider a measure on Yemen, and I'm a little bit puzzled by that. The reason why Representative Khanna took this step is because for months, while this terrible carnage has unfolded in Yemen, this House has done nothing. And we just learned that the Saudi government was directly involved in the killing of a Washington Post journalist, and again, nothing at all. And the Republicans took the unprecedented step of basically derailing this privilege resolution. It is unprecedented. Over 100,000 Yemeni children have already perished because of war-triggered hunger and disease over the past 2 years. I mean, why is the Republican leadership stripping us of the right to debate? According to the UN, 14 million people in Yemen, half the population, face an imminent and catastrophic famine not seen in 100 years if this war is not ended. Why is the Republican leadership stripping our right to debate? I don't understand what you're afraid of. Why we? And it's not like we have a lot to do. I mean, we're going to be talking about gray wolves today, and we're not even going to be able to, we're not voting on this until Friday. There's nothing going on. I mean, certainly we should have time to debate this important humanitarian issue. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield now 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank Ranking Member McGovern and Representative Khanna for all he's done to help lead the efforts to end the United States' unauthorized war in Yemen. Congress's sole responsibility over offensive use of force is outlined in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress shall have power to declare war. James Madison argued that this power is fully and exclusively vested in the legislature. Yet today, House Republicans are attempting to avoid their responsibilities by sneaking unrelated language into this rule, which will prohibit consideration of a war powers resolution pertaining to the U.S.-Saudi war in Yemen. To be clear, they took a bill about removing gray wolves from the endangered species list in North America and included a provision prohibiting even just the discussion of war in Yemen. Now, there are rare Arabian wolves native to Yemen, about 1,000 or 2,000 roaming in the Middle East. Canis lupus arabs is the subspecies of gray wolf. But this is a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is the deprivileging of House Resolution 138, this is just another abdication of our responsibilities as members of Congress. We are literally elected to make decisions about war and peace, and we are failing to do the most basic function of our job to uphold the Constitution. We should at least have the courage to make the decisions about war and about conflicts in which we are entangling our constituents who serve in the military. Today, as Mr. McGovern said, Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, with the UN saying that 14 million people, half the population of Yemen, are either experiencing full-blown famine at the risk of death by starvation as soon as the end of the year. Since 2015, U.S. forces have been backing the Saudi war by assisting in the targeting, logistical support, and refueling deadly Saudi airstrikes in a war that has nothing to do with fighting al-Qaeda. By reasserting Congress's authority over war,
was recognized for an additional minute.
We can end active U.S. participation in a Saudi-led conflict in which the Saudis are imposing a blockade to literally starve millions of Yemenis to death. If the U.S. ends its involvement, Saudi leader Mohammed bin Salman will be forced to the negotiating table to end his brutal bombing campaign and blockade of the food. Even the Senate isn't afraid to take this up. In March, under Leader Mitch McConnell, the Senate debated and voted on the unconstitutional war in Yemen. 44 senators voted for the measure. A bipartisan group led that. Unfortunately, rather than upholding our founding values, the leadership in this House has chosen to quietly insert a measure to block the House from debating the war. I urge my colleagues to reject this cynical tactic. Whether you agree or not about ending the illegal U.S.-Saudi war, vote against this rule so you can allow us to do our jobs and vote to do what we swore to uphold, our sole authority to debate and vote on war. I yield back.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nobody's afraid to debate anything here on the House floor. The fact is, though, that the U.S. is no longer providing the very support that the Khanna resolution seeks to cut off, making this action unnecessary. It's based on a factually faulty premise. We are not involved in hostilities in Yemen, so the War Powers Act should not apply. As a result, even if this resolution passed both chambers, DOD would not need to alter any of its activities. So like I said again, in a few short weeks, the Democrats will assume majority. They'll be able to hold all the hearings and markups and votes that they want on this matter, and as it should be. So forcing this type of vote now, and the remainder of this Congress, in my humble opinion, is simply unnecessary. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 3 minutes time to my good friend from Bozeman, Montana, Mr. Gianforte.
Gentleman from Montana is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for the time. Like many Montanans, I have a deep respect for our environment. I support protecting our rich and diverse wildlife and believe we can support multiple use of lands while conserving species. Unfortunately, we've seen environmental groups use misinformation and litigation to keep species listed that have already recovered. In 2013, the Obama administration's Fish and Wildlife Service evaluated the gray wolf populations across the United States. It found that the species no longer warranted protection under the Endangered Species Act. Rather than celebrating the recovery, serial litigants and extremists filed lawsuits to stop the process. Montana has been fortunate. Through federal legislation, the wolf has been delisted in Montana since 2011. Even without ESA protection, the species has continued to recover to a point nearing overpopulation. While the focus of this legislation is wolves, a similar issue is playing out in Montana over the grizzly bear in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Just last year, the grizzly bear was delisted there. I celebrate the recovery of this species, but it had recovered more than a decade ago, according to scientists who have spent their lives studying the grizzly. Using sound science and reliable data, they found the ecosystem reached maximum carrying capacity of the grizzly bear 16 years ago. But serial litigants have repeatedly thwarted the delisting efforts of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The unnecessary delay in delisting species has, in this case, created unnecessary stress on the bears and impacted our communities. The overpopulation of the grizzly pushes them into our communities and increases the opportunities for attacks. We must address the flaws in the Endangered Species Act to ensure species are delisted when they have recovered and to prevent the law being used as a bludgeoning tool for special interest groups to block critical projects. I support H.R. 6784 and the rule that we're considering, the Manage Our Wolves Act, and I urge passage. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Montana yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, while my Republican friends want to dedicate the next 3 days to talking about gray wolves, people are being murdered every single hour in Yemen. The Saudi-led effort even bombed a school bus filled with innocent children. So it seems to me that there could be no more important time for a debate in the House on ending U.S. military support for this war. And I just don't know what the Republican majority is afraid of. Privileged resolutions, I want my colleagues to understand this, by members of this House have always been allowed to be debated on this House floor under Republican and Democratic majorities alike until now, until today. And I don't know what the Republican majority is afraid of. Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. In this rule, the wolves bear their fangs, not American wolves, but Saudis who are willing to sever heads, dismember opponents, and bomb the innocent. This rule is truly a wolf in wolf's clothing. By blocking a vote on whether America should continue to aid and abet Saudi atrocities, this Congress would remain an obedient lapdog to President Trump's impulses and not the watchdog for American values. The Saudi ruthless war in Yemen has created what so many have described as the largest humanitarian disaster on our planet today, and yet it continues. American support for Saudi atrocities is truly a stain on our nation with which so many of our country members are not familiar. But without American spare parts, American targeting, American weapons and bombs, and until recently, American refueling, this killing could not occur. My colleague mentioned the school bus. 40 little children murdered in August, and scrawled across the bomb that was there next to that bus were words that meant made in America. That's the message that we are sending there. That's where American tax dollars are going. The Trump administration last week belatedly said it would stop refueling. That is insufficient. If we are to stop Saudi killing, we must stop all of the assistance that they are receiving. Now, of course, there has been attention on Saudi murders of late in a different area, about one person, about the dismemberment of an American resident, legal American resident, who was a leading journalist in the city. And after taking the standard Trump approach of denying everything and saying he accepted the lies and the denials of the Saudis, Mr. Trump dodged again by saying, quote, "I'm going to leave it up to Congress." And so what is this Congress doing about the Khashoggi atrocity? Absolutely nothing. That's what should have been in this rule. It's to do something about the sanctions and the disclosure. 40 of us asked this past month for the administration to brief us on what they knew before Mr. Khashoggi was murdered and whether they warned him about that, and we have had a deafening silence in response to our request on that and on cutting off assistance to Yemen. Only news that even an audio of the gruesome murder of Mr. Khashoggi, we don't know whether it included the sound of the bone saw that the Saudis apparently used to dismember him. But even a murder will not cause some in this leadership to stand up to President Trump and this atrocious regime. Do you have another 30 seconds?
I yield the gentleman 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for additional 30.
I look forward to a Congress with the courage to end support for these crimes, to cease American sales to the Saudis, and to do something to hold Mr. Khashoggi's killers accountable. But to say wait until a much improved new Congress comes into session to do anything about it means that tonight and every day going forward to January 3rd, more children will be starved, will be victims of cholera, will be victims of bombings and blockades. When this Congress has the power to do something about it, that we ought to exercise today by rejecting this rule.
Members, time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To help steer the debate back to the issue on the agenda that we're considering today, it's my pleasure to give 2 minutes to the chairman of the Western Caucus, the organization that stands for finding solutions to the challenges that we face, not only in the western United States, but all over the country. The good gentleman from the state of Arizona, Mr. Paul Gosar.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to urge support for H.R. 6784. Our federal wolf policy has gone rabid. From a policy standpoint, we're foaming at the mouth. As chairman of the Western Caucus, I've been trying for years now to return some sanity to the way the Fish and Wildlife Service classifies and manages our wolf populations on federal lands and otherwise. Make no mistake, everyone who votes for Mr. Duffy's bill are big supporters of making sure wolf populations are robust and sustainable and healthy for the next century and more. This bill is about fixing a federal failure. Wolf populations across the country have made impressive gains and recovered quite nicely, despite federal involvement rather than because of it. I've seen this firsthand, whether it comes to Pacific habitat listing decisions or the rate at which the government adapts and responds to new situations on the ground. The federal government has been sluggish and out of touch when it comes to managing and recovering wolf populations, but the wolf has nevertheless persevered. It's now considered recovered by all relevant measures and metrics evaluating its status. As a consequence, this bill makes necessary adjustments. It removes the species from the endangered list as required by the statute for any recovered species, but empowers states to manage their unique habitats and populations in accordance with their storehouse of expertise and local knowledge. State management plans developed for wolf populations are antidote to repeated federal blunders, both for this species and quite a few others. But for now, we're talking about the wolf and the fact that this bill will put states at ease. We need to stop jerking their chain and hand them the reins. If we do, the wolf will have the best chance of continuing to make a steady gains range-wide. I urge adoption of H.R. 6784, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this rule, which will pave the way for a vote on a bill that will summarily delist the gray wolf from protections under the Endangered Species Act by congressional fiat, in direct contradiction to our nation's animal protection policies that have done so much to preserve the diversity of animal existence over the last 45 years. In addition, in keeping with the sad track record of this Republican-controlled Congress, this is yet another closed rule, number 102 over the last 2 years to be exact, that will prohibit consideration of any amendments. Most egregious of all, however, this rule includes a totally non-germane provision that will deny debate of a separate resolution that will end U.S. participation in the Saudi-led coalition's intervention in Yemen's civil war. This separate resolution, the Kahana resolution, which I'm an original co-sponsor of, will be effectively blocked from congressional consideration and debate by passage of this rule, despite the humanitarian crisis and indiscriminate coalition airstrikes which American forces have enabled with refueling, logistical, and technical support over the last 3 years. This bipartisan resolution deserves debate, and as a co-equal branch of government, Congress should not be shirking its duty once again by allowing U.S. military force to be used at the whim of the executive branch. Sadly, this rule is another example of the complete abdication by the 115th Congress of its duty to act as a check on a co-equal branch of government. This rule is another surrender by a weak-kneed majority on its way out the door to the executive branch. To quote The Hollow Man by T.S. Eliot, this Republican 115th Congress is ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to yield 3 minutes to the good gentleman from Northern California, a member of the House Natural Resources Committee, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from Northern California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my colleague, Mr. Newhouse, thank you for your leadership on this bill. I do rise today in support of this rule that includes consideration of the Manage Our Wolves Act, introduced by my colleague from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy. The legislation would remove gray wolves from the federal endangered species list and allow states like California to more effectively manage local populations. As the numbers of the gray wolf continues to explode in population to nearly 6,000 in the lower 48 states, yet the species continues to be classified as endangered for nearly 40 years now. It really makes no sense, which the numbers, they speak for themselves. Even in my district in Northern California, gray wolves have reemerged in 2015 after having been listed as extinct since 1924. Not surprisingly, the reemergence of the gray wolves has caused a number of problems for ranchers, their livestock, as well as citizens in their homes with their pets, and a decimation of the wildlife population. Cattlemen, farmers, local communities have continued to advocate for protections against wolves to no avail. There have been efforts in recent years to even delay or outright ban all nighttime hunting and trapping in California of other predators like coyotes, etc. Adoption of such a plan and a ban on such would have disastrous unintended consequences for rural communities across my district and indeed across the West. Any attempt to curtail or outright ban people in local communities from protecting themselves, their own private property, from these predators should be opposed. That's why I wrote a letter to the Fish and Wildlife Director earlier this year urging the service to delist the gray wolf, the range-wide based on overwhelming support or evidence supporting the delisting, This is based on the Fish and Wildlife Service's own 5-year recommendation for a relisting. Management of gray wolf populations will continue to be extremely limited unless the species is removed from the Endangered Species Act. The fact remains, states are better equipped to responsibly manage local wolf populations to meet the needs of local communities, ranchers, livestock, as well as decimated wildlife populations. We have seen gray wolf management successes in states like Montana, Wyoming, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It's past time that we're able to add states like California and others to this list as well. We need swift passage of this bill because the endangerment and the damage being done to local ranchers with their livestock, the endangerment to communities, people in their homes, out for a walk, is unnecessary and it's not right. We need these tools for local control so we don't have to unnecessarily endanger and harass rural Americans with regulations that are poorly thought out and indeed ignoring Fish and Wildlife Service own recommendation to delist this species. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, let me again remind my colleagues that what the Republicans are proposing here is that the next 3 days be dedicated to the gray wolf. We're not debating health care, we're not debating the economy or jobs or keeping the government running, but it's to this. And they bring it to us under a rule that is completely closed, so there's no amendments that are made in order. And the rule is even worse because it basically undercuts the privilege resolution introduced by Mr. Khanna so we could debate this horrific war going on in Yemen. I mean, it takes my breath away at the lengths that this majority goes through to basically deny members of Congress the right to be able to talk about important issues. And Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the author of the privilege resolution on Yemen, the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman McGovern, for your moral leadership. I rise in strong opposition to this rule that will deny members of Congress an up or down vote about whether the United States should be complicit in the war in Yemen. Let's be very clear. This is unprecedented. In American history, never has the Speaker of the House and the majority denied a member of Congress a vote on matters of war and peace. This is basically rendering ineffectual the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was passed in a bipartisan fashion after Vietnam because our nation said never again are we going to make the mistake of Vietnam. We're going to make sure that if a member of Congress calls for a vote, that members of Congress have the Article 1, Section 8 responsibility to vote on matters of war and peace. And what the majority is saying, that if the President of the United States and the Speaker believe we should be in war, we should be in war. It doesn't matter what members of Congress think. That's what they are doing with this rule. Now, They are arguing that we are not complicit in the hostilities of Yemen, to invoke the War Powers Act. But you read every article written on this in the international press or national press, and it starts with a simple line: the U.S.-backed Saudi coalition efforts in bombing. Of course we're complicit. Do you think people in Yemen don't think we're complicit? Do you think people in the Middle East or our allies don't think we are complicit? With due respect, Congressman Newhouse says, well, why not wait? Why not wait a few weeks until we're in the majority? Congressman Newhouse, Special Envoy Griffith and every report has said that 500,000 children will die. 500,000 children will die in the matter of months. They don't have aid. They don't have nutrition. And let's be very clear on what we're doing. While we're bombing the ports of Hodeidah, we are not allowing food and aid to get to those kids. And when history is written, they're not going to say Jim McGovern did this, or Ro Khanna did this, or Newhouse did this. They're going to say, how did the Congress not allow a vote while hundreds of thousands of kids were not allowed food and medicine? That's not the America that I believe in. It's not the America that so many Republican colleagues believe in. There's a reason that our founders gave Congress the power over war and peace, because we have to go and answer to our constituents. And I'll tell you something, there's not a single American who wouldn't want the violence to end and allow food and medicine to get to those kids who are going to face death if we do nothing. I plead with my Republican colleagues, please vote no on this resolution. Let's have a debate. Let's have a debate about the starvation and the killing going on there, and do the right thing for our Constitution and the world. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. We know what's going on in Yemen, so none of us can escape the responsibility we have to either endorse or ignore the suffering that's occurring there. Thousands of victims in Yemen, hundreds of thousands dying of starvation, and it's happening in some cases quickly. People living in their homes under a bomb die instantly. In other cases, the suffering is prolonged, badly injured, no medical help to ease the suffering, let alone save the life. But in the case of most, it's prolonged through starvation. Children not having access to their mother's milk, not having access to aid that is in the port but it's getting bombed and it can't be delivered. That's happening every single day. The UN report says of the 28 million people in Yemen, about 20 million are in danger of humanitarian disaster. That's happening. There's no dispute that it's happening. Here's the question. Right now, that is being done with the authority of the executive branch of the United States government. It means that that suffering that's avoidable and hardly inevitable is being done in your name and in mine. Mr. Khanna has brought forth a resolution that allows us to have a debate on this floor as to whether we will condone the continuation of that policy of inflicting the loss of innocent life, women, children, citizens of Yemen. This rule prohibits us from accepting responsibility as to whether we will condone or condemn or oppose that policy. We have no justification for failing to do our job. Let us debate. This policy of Saudi Arabia of inflicting massive civilian casualty and suffering, for what? What what national interest of this country is at stake by allowing that to continue? And some, including me, may say this threatens our national interest, because our national interest is to defend innocent life. It's not to kill innocent life. It's to stand with allies who are going to be honest and transparent with us as well as their own citizens. This blank check that our administration has given to Saudi Arabia for massive killing that is occurring in Yemen, or individual assassination that is occurring in Turkey,
the gentleman's recognized for additional 30.
Is wrong. And the question for us is, will we accept the minimal responsibility that we have in our job to have a debate and say, no more will this be done in our name? I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close. Just to inquire as to my friend, Mr. McGovern, if he has any further speakers.
I'm the last speaker, so.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, undermining endangered species protections isn't a national emergency. We shouldn't be prioritizing it today. And not only is this rule a closed one, as you've heard from our side over and over and over again, Republicans took the unprecedented step of removing the privilege status of a resolution that would have given us a chance to debate the United States' support of the war in Yemen. We should be voting on this. People are dying every minute in Yemen. And our silence and our inaction means that we are complicit. You know, I've always believed that the United States stands for anything. We need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. There was a time when the issue of human rights was a bipartisan concern. But it's clear that this administration doesn't give a damn about human rights. But that doesn't mean that this institution should follow suit. Human rights ought to be the centerpiece of our foreign policy. And there are innocent people being killed every single day. Children who are riding to school in buses, the buses have been bombed, where these children have died, have been murdered. And all my Republican friends can say, oh, you know, you could take care of that, you know, after January when you're in charge. We're just going to spend the next 3 days dedicated to the issue of gray wolves. I mean, really? There is so much real work in front of us, including our most basic responsibility of funding this government and reauthorizing programs like the National Flood Insurance Program, the Violence Against Women's Act, and the Farm Bill. I go on and on and on. Education costs are skyrocketing. Americans are afraid coverage for their pre-existing conditions will be ripped away by this administration and its allies in Congress, because you've done it, tried to do it dozens and dozens and dozens of times. How about doing something about that? It was interesting during the campaign, my Republican colleagues were rushing to every microphone they could find to say that they somehow supported covering pre-existing conditions. Let me remind everybody, and especially my Republican colleagues, that that was a Democratic idea that you opposed. This was the worst election for a Republican president since Watergate. Maybe that's why Republicans are trying to rewrite history. But here's another politically popular idea Republicans should follow: bringing an end to the most closed Congress in history. Let's let some sunlight in. Don't wait until January. Start today by voting against this closed rule and demand action on things that our constituents actually care about. And just one final note again on this unprecedented move of basically denying us the right to debate this war in Yemen. I mean, I agree with what Mr. Khanna said. History is going to look back on our inaction, not only on the war in Yemen, but on our inaction dealing with the brutality of the Saudi regime. I mean, I would thought that when we came back, that one of the first items up on the agenda would be holding the Saudi government accountable. And instead, we got nothing. And not only do we get nothing, you take the unprecedented step of denying a member of this House the right that he has under the privileges of this House to debate this issue of war. This is so wrong. It is so wrong. This is damaging to the institution. and it shows a callous disregard for what is happening in Yemen. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, do the right thing and vote against this rule. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to provide a closing statement or the consideration of H.R. 6784, the Manage Our Wolves Act. You know, Mr. Speaker, wolves were once hunted to near extinction in the lower 48 states. The gray wolf was listed by the federal government as an endangered species in 1974. Today, though, gray wolves are thriving, both in my state of Washington as well as throughout the United States, with more than 5,000 wolves now living in the contiguous United States. According to Washington State's Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state's wolf population has grown over the past 9 straight years to 22 packs that contain at least 120 wolves. Mr. Speaker, the gray wolf reaching recovered status truly is an Endangered Species Act success story, and we should celebrate. Mr. Speaker, permanently listing species under the Federal Endangered Species Act is not how the process was ever intended to work. The process should rely on the best available science. It is a sign of progress that the species has recovered from the brink of extinction and no longer merits protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And that is the key point here. While we seek to delist the gray wolf from the federal ESA, we are empowering each state to manage their respective populations. Washington State has a strong wolf conservation and management plan that has received broad support, and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife is committed to maintaining a viable wolf population in the state of Washington. Wolves remain protected in the state recovery plan, but so long as an arbitrary federal line divides our state, and as you heard, the state of Oregon, listing the wolf on one side and not on the other, our state managers are prevented from effectively managing the population within our states. As I mentioned, wolves do not know borders. Mr. Speaker, states are equipped to be more responsive and accountable to the needs of local communities than federal agencies are, and they deserve the flexibility to manage the growing gray wolf populations. We should celebrate the return of the iconic species like the gray wolf. But meanwhile, states must be empowered to manage populations to ensure the healthiest balance between humans, between wildlife, and the ecosystems. I encourage my colleagues to support the rule and its underlying legislation, again, H.R. 6784, the Manage Our Wolves Act. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
All time having expired, without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection,
Mr. Speaker,
Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeas and nays.
Okay. The nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of House Resolution 1142 will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6666 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.